I'm Amy Smith Stewart, and I'm a curator at the Aldrich, and I'm here today speaking on Zoom with Lucia Hierro, artist. And Lucia, where are you right now?
I am in Washington Heights, New York.
I'm so excited to be working on your first solo museum exhibition for the Aldrich, which will now open in February 2021.
Yeah.
The first work that I saw of yours was actually from the Mercado series with Latchkey.
And with Latchkey
at Independent.
At Independent, yeah.
I was wondering, I was immediately taken with that work, and maybe you could just describe, because it's an ongoing series, and we are going to include a selection of those works, as well as maybe one or two new works from that series in the exhibition. Just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that body of work and when you started it and how it's grown.
Yeah, so I started something similar to it in 2000 and I'm going to say 2015, 2016. And it started off very small. It's one of those things that happens to artists where you work on something and you sort of stash it in a corner because you're sort of unsure, or it scares you, or it's too weird looking and you just don't know what to do with it yet. Because I was working on what I called a still life series, where I had objects arranged in these really very colorful backgrounds. I called them bodegones after the Spanish tradition, and those evolved into the actual bags or sort of tote bags filled with things, and the new form that they took on, which was the plastic bags, the sort of quintessential New York or supermarket thank you bags. That seemed too much of an obvious form for me. I wanted to sort of abstract it a little more and have it look very familiar, but defamiliarize it enough so that you can stay with the object and start to look into what was in it. And a lot of these are made following people around Washington Heights. I go on these long walks. I always say that's part of my studio practice, is going for walks around my neighborhood. And I grew up here. I grew up in Washington Heights, and I lived in the Bronx for a little bit, where my studio is. So I know the neighborhoods well enough that I'm walking around and people will say hi to me. And I'm constantly looking at what they're shopping for, and what are some of the things generationally that are different in the way that let's say first generation or second generation Dominican kids are shopping for. And you see a similarity in a lot of the bags, what they're getting. A lot of them very culturally traditional and specific. You can sometimes tell when a 13-year-old is buying something for their mother. Wow. Like it's very clear, like, you don't like this, but it's clear someone is going to cook this. So I wanted to make those bags very authentic in that way. Some of them are themed, some of them have ingredients for something.
So, and the scale of them, actually, because the first ones I saw were life size. So you could really, first of all, they're translucent because they're made out of a polyorganza, and then they're digitally printed. Is that correct?
Yep.
And talk a little bit about your collaboration with your mother on these works.
Yeah. So when I first went to school, I was formally trained as a painter, and then I went to grad school as a painter, which at this point is it's a very broad thing. When you go into the program, you see a lot of sculpting and painting and photography and painting, and the mediums sort of intersect. But I started working on fabric, and I didn't know how to sew. But my mother has a long history with her family. In fact, the way that they came to this country was through my grandmother, who worked at in the garment industry in New York. And so she brought all her kids in to work with her, basically. It's the only way that they were able to come here. And and so she actually was one of the few who really loved to sew. She didn't see it as a sort of chore or something associated with sort of the struggle and that sort of thing. I for years was like, those stories sound awful. I would have never wanted to do that as a teenager, and so I put it off, and finally had to confront it, and she really was great at, okay, let's start with like simple hand stitching, and then we'll move into the machine, and then you'll do all these things.
Exciting thing about the exhibition at the Aldrich is it's also going to debut a new series of sculptures that specifically are located, a vernacular feature of the South Bronx, these wrought iron gates.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little weird to talk about work when it doesn't exist in physical space yet.
Yeah.
It's like a proposal. This is
Yes.
the next generation. It's just proposals. We're just going to be giving proposals. No, so the series came out of looking at the way that houses in the Bronx, I think actually not quite the South Bronx, but I was living in Parkchester for a while in the Bronx, and there are these rows of houses and buildings, and there are these little gates outside of the buildings where these circulars or pieces of mail or whatever are sort of rolled and stuffed between these gates, the ornate part of these gates. And I kept bumping into it and seeing how people were moving out of those houses, and the houses were vacant, and these things would yellow and stay out, and just like, it was such a marker of something, of a transition, and of an economy, you know, and have to do something with this. And at some point I was flipping through an Oldenburg book or something, and I saw something that I thought, you know what, these would be amazing if they were, you know, these really, really large sculptures. And I think the vernacular is really across, I think you know, you see that everywhere in Manhattan. You see that type of gate design or whatever. It's sort of ubiquitous in New York. And so right now what I'm doing is researching sort of the history of that tradition through Italian immigrants who then hire a lot of actually Dominicans. It's a highly like Dominican field of workers, where my father's cousin owns an iron company in New Jersey. And he actually started being an apprentice to an Italian who owned the business, and then he opened up his own business. So that's like, I found that super fascinating, and I thought, okay, this is another way of working these things into.
No, but I think it's interesting, you know, the cultural markers that are embedded in your work, and also talking about translation, because all of these, there's so much family traditions that are alive in your work. You know, yes, we talked about the tradition of sewing, and your grandmother was a seamstress, but also just a lot of the mercado, the bags actually hold recipes, family recipes, you know, that are specific to the Dominican culture, but specifically to your home, to your family life. I think one of the first bags actually was a recipe for a popular Dominican dish.
Sweet beans, which is something that we have, it's like a holiday thing. And honestly, I think one of the other things that is a part of making and assembling these things is that I'm constantly trying to remember and recall, which is a little insane. It could drive you a little insane because you forget so much. And someone once asked me, like, when are you gonna, you know, stop making a certain, you know, there's a generation that had a certain way of making dishes. And then you have that translation, like, I'm talking about like in the Dominican Republic with very fresh ingredients and all this stuff. And then you have the move to New York translation of using canned,
Right.
canned things. And then you have like the younger generation that is then going, how do I make this but healthy? and so I, there's a point where I was making these things and somebody goes, well, that's still very like your mom's generation. When are you going to start making the ones that are like our generation? And I said, soon. I think that right now, I think that now I'm sort of at this point where I'm making them as I remember them, and a lot of the times they're actually wrong, and there's things missing, and that's all a part of the work too. So I don't want people to hold on to these things and go, oh, if I look in her bag, I can make this dish. Because actually, there's a lot of things that I'll forget to include, or maybe compositionally they don't look good in the work or something like that. But yeah, they're definitely based on these things that my mother tried so hard to teach me when I was a young girl, and I never wanted to do it because I wanted pizza or something. And then as I got older, I realized how important they were, and then I wanted to make them. And then, as I became an artist, I wanted to preserve them, and that's what the bags do.
Yeah, they feel like that. They also feel like portraits. They have that quality of kind of. They have a magnetic quality to them. I mean, it's strange when you look at them because they feel more that there's some kind of personal history or personal story and why they're all together, which, as you mentioned, comes out of that still life series that you did. You started those after you graduated from Yale, the still life series, or did it first begin while you were still there?
They started right after. I went to, because I had just moved back. I moved back to Washington Heights after Yale, and I didn't have a studio, and so I thought I'll work from home. And at first, I think I was making them just as collage, like actual paper collage pieces from home. And then I got a little studio, and I started making them as these fabric pieces, because I started buying, I did have somebody still at Yale who was like being nice enough to let me print things even after I graduated. Shout out to Ken Lavelle for doing that. I felt like it's like contraband. We're like, oh my God, we're still printing in here. It was very sweet of him. I think he saw that, that I was onto something, and he didn't want to break that. And so so I kept printing on the fabric, and then I found just like regular Joann's fabric, like printable stuff that you can put through your printer, which in the long term is probably not the best ink and not the best result, but it got the job done in terms of me making studies and figuring out how these objects were going to work. And they're very awkward and kind of limp object, like they
right.
seem, but I think that was one of the things that I loved about, seeing Oldenburg's work is not the shiny like America, it's not the shiny Americana stuff. Right. It's like sad and limp, and I always thought, like, God, that's such a great like when I think of the working, the working people of America, I think of them as absolutely exhausted. And I think that that's what was beautiful about those works that he had. And I wanted a lot of the portraits to sort of also like carry that. I wanted them to be austere, but then also just look absolutely tired.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, they do have that feeling. Well, they feel very contemporary, but they also feel like a little bit, because of the softness of the material, and like you said, limp, or just, I think when you think of soft, you think of something that's not necessarily, not hard edge, so it doesn't have that aggressive. It's like maybe a little bit more human or eccentric. But it does feel as though that there's a personal history, a personal story, and the juxtaposition of them is interesting, because thinking about the still life series, which is really a response, I remember reading, to European still life painting, and how when you were studying that at SUNY Purchase, you felt as though you had no kind of relationship to the objects within the still lives themselves.
Yeah, yeah, there was, I think, less so, you know, I always had a thing where, and I think this happens when you're watching something that you can relate to, but you know, you have no real like experience of. I think that goes across the board with anyone. I always loved those paintings. Like, I always thought they were very beautiful, and that there was something very sentimental about them wanting to sort of, yeah, preserve and have a photo of like, this is what our, or painting a portrait, this is what our culture was about in this specific time, and or a window into our lifestyle, or whatever, this moment in time, which I thought was very poetic and beautiful. Except also that moment in time was a very brutal moment of colonialism, and conquest and violence and all of that. And I think that once I realized that those two things were a thing, I wanted to make my own. It's from a completely different, right, standpoint of what we call, right, the quote unquote like neo-colonialism, and from that angle, I was able to appreciate those works as I'm looking at them and I'm studying them to figure out, you know, what were the little things that made them so fast, that make those Dutch still lifes so fascinating, you know. And it is those very rare specific things, like specific birds that they had in a taxidermy or whatever, that were just like hanging around, and thinking, okay, I want to make every composition have these like weird moments where people may not necessarily relate to that one object, and or very much relate to one object, and the other ones sort of fall behind.
Well, I think it's really interesting the way that, because I think you and I have talked about this, is, you know, looking at 21st century advertising and then looking at Dutch Vanitas paintings, you know, and really the symbolism within these kind of, the way that symbols move through time and through culture, and what in fact they may mean, and how that meaning actually also changes upon who the audience is, right? Like who's actually reading this, who's looking at this. And I think in a way your work is kind of taking that perspective as well, because it is your individual experience, but also when you shop, you say like you're you know, kind of following shoppers in your neighborhood, and you're visiting you know, the neighborhood delis or bodegas, and looking at what they're selling, and how that is very specific to not maybe to your own biographical experience and your own history, but how it's really an intersectional experience, because, and also trying to, as you were saying, like recall from memory these traditions, and how that moves over time.